Thanks so much for coming out, having such a great turnout. Great to see everybody this afternoon. I'm George Calamaris in the Department of English and Linguistics, and before I introduce our writers today, I wanted to give some thank yous for our sponsors, the generous support of the Department of English and Linguistics, the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, the College of Arts and Sciences. And I'm also grateful, obviously, to College Access Television here at IPFW. You will probably turn on the TV set at sometime during the next 20 years and catch a glimpse of yourself eating a cookie. So I'd eat the cookie now, probably. But no, seriously, they run these into perpetuity. And also, I'd like to thank our anonymous donors. We've had the Visiting Writer Series going for a number of years. 25 years, maybe? Wow, just dawned on me. It's a quarter century we've been doing this. So I'm really thankful to all the sponsors that we have. And we have two wonderful guests today, Andrea Rexillius and Eric Baus, who will be reading. I'll go ahead and introduce Andrea first, and she'll be reading first. And then I'll give an intro for Eric. In her most recent book, New Organism Essay, Andrea Rexillius writes, and I'm quoting here, "In the open, without a definite territory or identity, I am ignorant of my own way of filling a gap." Her new book is full of gaps, exposing the holes in our reflections, gender perceptions, cultural identities, and within language itself. In fact, it's the holes within discourse that her poems fill, even as they expose the absence and ongoing struggle to fill them. In other words, at the core of her poetry lies a great paradox, the process of filling what seemingly can never be filled. In this, Andrea takes her place with other marvelous poets, including one of her heroes, the French prose poet Francis Ponge. And while her work reaches back into a tradition, it simultaneously makes its own way, exploring new, refreshing territory with stimulating and evocative images and perceptions. This shouldn't surprise us, I suppose, as Andrea has spent many years honing her craft. Born in Winfield, Illinois, she currently lives in Denver, Colorado, where she teaches in and coordinates the Mile High MFA program at Regis University. Her publications include 3 books. I mentioned New Organism already. Another book is Half of What They Carried Flew Away, another wonderful title. Another one is To Be Human is to Be a Conversation. These fantastic titles. You really are. As well as chapbooks, many chapbooks that she's published, or a couple of chapbooks as well. Her creative and critical writing has appeared in numerous anthologies, including Anne Carson, Ecstatic Liar, The Volta Book of Poets, 60 Morning Talks, serial interviews with contemporary authors, and on and on. And the literary journals, the Academy of American Poets, the Colorado Review, Denver Quarterly, the Feminist Wire, How To, Jubilat, and many others. In his review of Half of What They Carried Flew Away in Tin House magazine, Matthew Dickman writes the following. "This is a book that will not make an appearance on Prairie Home Companion, or perhaps even Poetry Daily, though it should. The more I reread Andrea's book, the more open and strange I feel. A great thing to get from experiencing art, which leads me to believe the book is about the inner territories of the self, that strange outer space world of our inner lives." And then he goes on to note, "Everyone should buy 2 copies, one for yourself and one for Garrison Keillor." So keep that in mind when you're browsing the books later today. Please join me in giving a very warm Fort Wayne welcome to Andrea Rexillius.
Thank you. Is that good? You can hear me? Okay. I will read a little bit from Half of What They Carried Flew Away for Garrison Keillor. But first, I'm going to start with new organism essays. And I'm going to read a little bit from the first section, which is titled Seance, A Critical Theory of Grief Sensations. I'm not sure what exactly to tell you about this piece other than I wrote it during a time when I was very busy with work, so I found that I wasn't able to dedicate as much time to my own writing. So what I began to do was I'd write one piece and then I'd take the last line of that piece and use that language to start the next page so that I wasn't always facing a blank page with very little time to figure out what to do with it. So you'll see a little bit of the linking that happens. And I'm starting about 5 poems in and ending about 5 poems short. So you're getting right in the middle of this piece. So, Seance, A Critical Theory of Grief Sensations. I no longer wish to escape without a trace like rust under the red lights of the city. I no longer want to leave stones behind to find my way back to the house. I walk the cages of the street, rattling their abandonment. In the morning, I stop at the post office. I walk through a glass door and suffer a migraine. I eat small vials of salt and sand and crushed oregano. I paint my rib cage red and make a print that looks like lungs on the wall. I reminisce about the color orange. I drink orange juice and lay on the lawn, still wet with dew. I watch clouds roll by and become a cloud. I sail into the air. I hyperventilate and come back down. I am a girl, and what does it feel like to be a girl? It feels like a hand over your mouth and on your thighs. Some say it is the sound of a rabbit before it is caught. It is the sound of the sky before it comes crashing down. Before it comes crashing down, it is suspended, and then as it moves, it evaporates. I conduct a study to find out which gender is more concerned with death. I find out it is men. I have never much regarded death or cared one way or the other, as long as I do not die by the hands of men in strange and brutal ways. Death has never been particularly interesting. I prefer the ocean depths or night sky to feel unwieldy. I have never wanted what was beyond death, except for the dust of it, to become a material, a fine grain of something, a thing the wind could truly lift, and to be disparate for once, and whole. To be in the sea and on the oak leaves, to be breath inside all the bodies, and to be unseen and slipping through all of those hands toward the light and away from the light, free of the face of the body. I face my body when a moth faces light. I graze the edges of the room, edges of the city, edges of the continent. I touch water with my ankles and my fingertips. Weather moves, and you move with it, your pores unlatching, your thighs unhinged in wild grasses and flowers above the beach, rushing headlong into them bending back and resting you gently against the earth. I told a girl I would meet her here, like this. We would know the moment. The sky would be a brand new sky. It would be bruised, and clouds would rush toward us like smoke. We would make a pilgrimage then. We would live in the nest of grasses at the ocean. We would live in Sonoma County. It wouldn't matter when. Okay, this next poem, I want to tell you a couple of things before I read it. Whenever I took creative writing workshops, the main critique I got was that my poems were not placed in the contemporary time period. There were no gas stations, no Snickers bars. I don't want them in my poems, but I did put Depeche Mode in this poem. And the reason is because in middle school, a boy gave me love letters. I didn't like Depeche Mode, so he gave me love letters and he made me swear I would never show them to anyone, and I didn't until I moved away in high school, and I showed a good friend of mine, and she said, "Those are Depeche Mode lyrics." So I didn't fall for it, by the way. I fell for it, but not for him. It wouldn't matter when the ice melted or when the fog lifted. It wouldn't matter how the water looked or where the horizon ended. We would not need a boat. I would become the boat or fin we would need to travel. I would become the face of death. I would face death and tell him to fuck off. He was a goth boy, too. I would tear up love letters death writes to me that are just Depeche Mode lyrics anyway. I will not drink Zima with death. I will not raise the roof with death. I walk away into a field of my own choosing, and as the sun comes down, I place the stone back inside my ear earnestly. I place the stone back inside my ear earnestly. I swallow the world and I listen to the world. I have met the world's ghost. I am related to trees and I know the tree's ledge. I am related to trees and I used to be a tree. Now I am uprooted. I am a new organism craving light. My mother is Francesca Woodman. She is standing in a room with a turtle. Our great problem is post-revolutionary, a space where one can be a sensation and outplay the law. My mother, Francesca Woodman, is at a loss for words. She is unsayable. Her body is a body of pictures. Are these pictures shocking? Only if you are underwater, and then they reflect grief sensations. Grief sensations touch the body the way light reverberates across water. The night of the ordeal of the grief, one remembers the moon, not the moon was yellow, tendrils, clouds brushing the face, the sky not black but navy, the moon elongated, harsh, gloriously alive, hot, sharp air against the face, the sky pressing the face, thinking there is no difference between what air is and what I am, except the pressure I put on it, the form I form around it. A critical theory of form. To breathe the word air, to sculpt it invisible against the sky, to birth the moon from one's mouth, to birth a dark, heavy wound and heave it toward the sky. One born within you, one born upon you, acted upon your body, acted upon your birth. If light assaults the surface of your skin, no, if light and not the skin shatters the way you face the moon in the sky. If light shatters how you face the moon in the sky, it is important to say the word stone, to feel heavy in your belly the deep, brutal stone, the gallstone, the kidney stone, the many stones the body pockets as grief, the size of baseballs, the size of a tiny marble, the heat stone, the life stone, the brittle salt of the bone stone. To lick the enamel across your teeth, to bring to the surface that magma, that marrow of the just beneath the skin stone. I want to think like a magus, as stones underwater reflect grief, how images capture tone and temperature of what is glimpsed, to glimpse why the root is made desperate by inability of its capture. Why, for instance, the word woman holds its own intention. One day on the street, I found a fissure. I thought it was my sex. I thought it looked like the sea, an amoeba. I was not afraid to be seen. I was afraid to be dismembered. Do you see? The scene is one of red pooling into clear water. Men want to see you bleed, my mother said, like a gutted fish, she said, like a submerged memory. On the surface of the water, I see an article. Perhaps the nuance is unintentional. Is it a verb? Is it a noun? The way female bodies surface. But I like the way a woman looks possessed, like a new organism underwater. Well, that's a good place to stop, but I'm going to skip 3 and read this one because of the times. They say if you are a woman, you are pulled by the tide. They call you a lunatic, hysterical, because the moon full makes you bleed. They suggest a hysterectomy. They suggest you stop troubling yourself with a vote. There is no need for a voice when you have an animal between your legs. Okay. And now for something weirder. So half of what they carried flew away. I got that title sort of from Eric Baus. I had been at the park and I pulled all the milkweed off the stalk. I don't know why exactly. And then I carried it home in a big puff of, milkweed fluff. And he saw me and said, or I saw him and I said, half of what I carried flew away. And he said, that's a great line. You should write that down. So I did, and then it changed to half of what they carried. This book, it kind of came in a strange way. I wrote the first page sort of spontaneously, and when I reread it, I thought, oh, that sounds like the beginning of a novel. I'm not a novel writer, but I thought, I'll pretend to write a novel and see what kind of poems come from that. So one of the very first problems after I got to page 2 was, oh shit, there has to be characters. Who will the characters be? So I had they on the first page, and I thought, well, I'll just leave it at that. It'll be they, and then I don't want to know who they are until the end of the book. So I tried to write it kind of not exactly naming who they were to myself or in the book, but as the book progressed and now that it's done, it reads kind of like a science fiction poem novel. They also seems to be, so they're aliens, they're also women, immigrants, ghosts, all of these kind of, I don't know. So I'll read the first page, and then the book's organized in 5 sections that are called residences. So there's first residence, desire, then water, emanation, weather, and territory. I'll read the first page so you can see how the whole thing started, and then I'm going to read some of weather, the 4th section. So half of what they carried flew away. First residence, desire. What they wanted most was to see things they had never seen before. When they were people, they felt relief. They were on a new sexual continent, willing to proclaim anything. They couldn't sleep. It was impossible for them to choose whether or not to be savage. They felt something. They indulge as a result of repeated colonization. They make armies. They decide they are as small as ants. It happens on the cellular level. It happens as a result of frustration, like daffodils in the middle of the Pacific. It was already happening, like the sun in this place. Their lungs helped them to arrive. Fourth residence, weather. Remembering they did not know themselves, took delight in seeing their own reflections arise. These are ordinary occurrences in the eyes and pupils of another, a body of water, seeing expansion and risk decrease in the images. Before observation, they both appear together. According to their recollections, they did not know themselves. Metaphor does not recognize its own savagery. And it sort of works like there's a journalist or somebody looking at a notebook and interviewing they. So this is the interview of their 4th crossing. And they're crossing over a river again and again in each section. That's the plot. So this is the interview of their 4th crossing. What is it to embrace water? Are you fearful near the edge or the middle? Could you symbolize your idea of the self? How do you not recognize your own face, hand, circumstance? Is it the breath or spirit contained in this glass? Is it primarily a verb or a noun? Why do you find clouds compelling? Are the circumstances for or against disruption? Were they bringing the light from the outside or inside of the glass? What does a ray of light embody? Is it based on a personal principle? Is it ovular or rectangular? How far are we from the bottom? How far is the bottom from the top? Extreme conditions bring delirium. Mirages impress on them an idea of experience, the shape-shifting silence all around. They were becoming more and more apocalyptic. They tried to explain, first by word of mouth, then by rapidly growing wounds wrapped in mist, like soldiers in trenches. They publish that they are devastated, absent, that each flight is a hectic response to unseen catastrophe. It is one in a series of analogies for interstates, general categories of cumulus metaphor, a matter of cloudiness, a matter of storms. What is the emanation of their image? They are from the early 1870s. They move from house to house like windows. They rise and fall. They are a demonstration. They continue to drift. Some become informants. They represent an emergence. They are marginal. They move in rivulets. They exist not only in their details, they contain their own extraordinary destiny. They live beside a family of small farmers. They are discovered and decide to immigrate. Their name is William. They are born a little girl. I do not know what it is they are like. What they move through feels like water. It is difficult for them to distinguish what is above from what is below. Clods of earth become not just synonymous, but identical to clouds. They often weep in the driest of climates. Moments recede from them. It is difficult for them to see what they are looking at. They are very close and very far from objects. When they speak, one cannot locate the exact position of their mouths. Often they are recognizable in fields, though not readily apparent. One can sense them in the absences. In the 21st iteration, they were disappointed their bodies were made of celluloid. After a while, they came to inhabit animals, trees, spots of light in the sky. In the 1950s, they operated by a series of inversions, turning song into spirit. They sang, and this singing flew into kinetic movement. It was noted, singing belongs to the taxonomy of ascension, all things the voice catches on, air, clouds, vapor, smoke, foam, steam, to make manifest a reply. The flickering energy of the pulse as music. It looks out invitingly where there are no boundaries, not even between their sexes. This is the answer of their fourth crossing. I am a common principle. I have lived upon this earth. I seek peace and solace. I place 100 dead bees on the windmills. I am waiting for you to notice my boundary. I have hoped to photograph each physical state. I am my own reflection in the water. I am doubling back to impend. I am living in the land of water. With all my power, I behold my face. The motif of appearance is deeper than recognizing an exterior. I inhabit and experience it. It is a state akin to revelation. I am seeing myself as a mother, as if seen by someone else. It is dizzying to have these eyes. And if water now, a great deal of water, suddenly came over me unexplained, I would progress to the depths with so much affection. It would be natural for me to understand what winter is. With tufts of wool, I run through this white, white country, shadowy and radiant in the distance, up the inclined plains, as far as the dark, gray-blue skies to other open places in which the pink of a cloud is slowly turning the gray, trembling sky golden. Thank you.
Andrea, that was wonderful. I hate to give an introduction. It's not that I don't want to introduce you, Eric. It's just that regular language after that falls far short. So anyway, I want to say a few words about Eric, and then we'll get back to the poetry. Eric Baus returns to the IPFW Visiting Writers Series after 8.5 years, and that appearance was nearly a decade ago. Itself a sweet return to his alma mater, from which he graduated in 2000 with a BA from our English department. Eric was a real gift to us at IPFW and has gone on to well-deserved prominence, first completing an MFA in poetry from the University of Massachusetts, and then completing a doctorate in English at the University of Denver. He currently teaches in the Mile High MFA program at Regis University. He's the author of 4 books of poetry, The Tranquilized Tongue from the esteemed City Lights Press books. You might know City Lights, the publisher of Allen Ginsberg and many other fine poets. Scared Text. You have to read Eric's titles real carefully because if you look at them, they almost look like different words. Scared, it's very easy to look at this and think he's saying sacred text, but Scared Text, winner of the Colorado Prize for Poetry. Tuned Droves, and The Two Sound, which was the winner of the Verse Prize, selected by Forrest Gander. A 5th book, How I Became a Hum, is forthcoming from Octopus Books in 2018. And notably, his poems have been translated into Spanish, Italian, and Finnish, and a bilingual Spanish-English edition of The Tranquilized Tongue is forthcoming, which is really wonderful to reach more readers that way. His poems, interviews, and essays have been anthologized in many places, including the Volta Book of Poets, 60 Morning Talks, serial interviews with contemporary authors, and a plethora of others. And in his review of The Tranquilized Tongue, the poet John Yao, who also came as a guest to the Visiting Writers Series many years ago, wrote the following: "This is a world of unpredictable and miraculous change, a world that is simultaneously philosophical and alchemical, an inseparable mixture of factual propositions and flights of fancy." What I admire most about Eric's poetry is its familiar strangeness. This is me now, not John Yao. And I yoke these two seemingly paradoxical words together quite deliberately, for the associations and juxtapositions of Eric's images offer in their strangeness what poet Andre Breton might call the marvelous. Eric's adventure into the marvelous feels anything but strange in a foreign way, and is instead somehow oddly familiar, as it is part of our own consciousness that we have either forgotten or neglected. Eric's words enliven and wake us up out of our stupor, saying into and unto us that neglect of the nuances of language is the enemy of the psyche. I think of his wonderful title poem in his first book, The Two Sound, where he describes the importance of attentiveness to what we see and how we describe it, how our seeing and looking shape what we say and how. And here's a quote from Eric's book: "Stay, I know the entire sound. To look out a window is to be embedded inside birds. If I could amplify your glass, atone for the sound of my incessant lips." Eric's poems indeed atone for the sound of our lips, asking us to reject mundane ways of talking and embrace new territories and deeper perceptions. Eric, your words lead us on all kinds of remarkable adventures, and I've always been just extraordinarily taken with them, and we are all so happy to welcome you home. Please join me in welcoming Eric Baus.
Thanks, George.
Oh, is that,
Yeah, it's close enough. Yeah. Oh, hey, Curtis. How's it going? It's nice to see so many old friends here, and this is really exciting. Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. And let me know if I sort of trail off or start like mumbling inaudibly. Like I have a tendency to do that. So,
You want me to bring that a little closer in?
no, I think it's okay. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and read a little bit from a couple things. Don't get scared with this. Like, I'm not going to like read like 400 pages. So I think I'll start off with the two sound because that was the book that I wrote while I was living here and when I was taking classes here and stuff. And a lot of people in this room contributed to this book in a number of different ways, and so it's really great to be back and to read this. So one of the things that happens with this book is years and years ago, Beth Simon, Beth retired, right? Okay, so I took a class with Beth one time, and she had an assignment that was use the word bird in a poem in which it's in no way symbolic because there's so much baggage attached to it, like, oh, birds equal this, the freedom or something like that, or beauty or nature or whatever. And so it's this sort of impossible prompt, and what I ended up doing is I just used the word bird like 4 million times in a book, so that you'd kind of like, its associations would empty out, and then other things would sort of fill it in, and it would be kind of the way that birds sort of flock together and are aware of the proximity of other kind of birds. Like I wanted the sort of language in the book to do that and sort of pick up what it was around. So this is the first sort of bird poem I wrote. It's very short. They wanted me to hold the bird calmly until its wings atrophied, until my hands filled with moot feathers. I remember something flapping. I forgot where I buried the bones. And some of the poems in this book, I don't know how well you can see this, but they're sort of scattered on the page a little bit. I kind of clustered the language around so that there would be multiple ways of reading it to kind of enact that sense of language flocking and connecting and disconnecting. So I was thinking birds with extremely long necks, and my sister sees I was using words I didn't know. She nods, and we know a voice. My mouth uses rain to say, a body is a sequence that counts as it moves. A body is a museum where we apologize for our voices, birds with inky wings flapping above the fire. My sister was thinking a dim constellation. My body is rain wired together. She nods once because a sequential feeling is what counts. We are half-sisters twice, birds with extremely long necks, using our indoor voice, using words we can't see. I apologize for my voice turning to dust. What I'm saying is a dim asterisk in my lips, born from the weather of a blistered tongue, thought torn in the shape of birds. My sister opens her eyes to say, something is always burning. She thinks the sun dims when anything falls, and I see every rattled out light bulb means my sister's pillow is smoke, shadow of cranes. Half the word filament is night. And the other thing that happens in this book kind of a lot is there's letters, and I was interested. Actually, George's introduction makes a lot of sense with this. The idea of like letters being this way of making something far away or strange familiar and more intimate in some way, knowable in some way. So a lot of these letters are kind of writing to these like kind of wild abstractions and trying to move towards the unknown and trying to bring the unknown closer to yourself. So I'll read a couple of these letters, and some of them are addressed to birds, and some of them are addressed to this sort of sister figure. Dear birds, I'm running out of numbers. Whenever I look at the clock, it's always turning 1:23 or 5:55. My mouth is always a 3 or a 1. Everything I see wants to be shaped like your wings when you said, I last saw her out in the rain. She said she got lost for several hundred pages, thinking glass was the X for my outstretched arms. Incidentally, she was unimpressed by the house of cards you constructed out of litmus paper. We are all so far from home. I remember the way she'd hold a parasol against the sun, watching carp lunge onto rocks, like being able to walk made us the solution for water. I don't know how many times I've called a stranger sister. And I guess that last line is how I think about how the sister functions in here, the idea of like, you're in a different city and someone looks familiar, but they're not. You know, someone that you know, like someone looks like a friend or they look like a family member or something. That moment of kind of intimate confusion is something I've experienced a lot. I don't know if it's poor eyesight or what, but so this is one of the Dear Sister letters. Dear Sister, sugar is suffering somewhere in water. When I'm talking to myself in the rain, I'm speaking to your frequency. Today, your voice was on the radio saying, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died of rheumatic fever, like it was the last digit of pi or something. What do you want me to do with that? I'm thinking through a skin of wet cloth. I'm an exponent of everything you've ever said. I can feel your wavelengths growing in every bite of apple, every damp step of ash. And this is another poem that's sort of like split apart on the page a little bit too. I'm not sure how much that helps to know that, but I sort of feel. And it can be read a couple different ways, but I'll pick one. So, she lies skylit under bones, branches, splinted limbs, a splintered fluorescence in an ash of breath. You've been my sister for a while now, a prism and lamplight, spilled sand in the bends of my back. She says her light enters through an abdomen, asks where it goes when it falls. The space between jaws says, take my throat out while you're at it, or panes of stained glass in a burnt husk of breath. Take my fish, my foot. She was a winter's worth of hum in my ghost. Bird bones born, a lung full of cinders, in a house between atmospheres. Don't even go back for your pillow. There's a lot of little things that I steal or have stolen from like just stuff I've overheard or from TV. Don't even go back from your pillow, I think was like when you're a little kid and it's like sort of fire safety stuff. You know, it's like if your house is on fire, just leave. Don't. And I thought I'd read a little bit from the middle section of this book. So this is actually a poem that I wrote in one of George's classes. This is probably the first good poem I ever wrote. And it's a prose poem, which is like the first time I was like, oh, I like prose poems, and then proceeded to write prose poems for 20 years. So this is based on a Max Ernst collage. And there's a sort of figure who's being pursued, and it's difficult to tell if they're a man or a woman, how they're dressed, and there's like, I remember it strangely. I think there's like sort of this bottle with like a peacock feather in it. I sort of half remember and half invent this image. So this is sort of trying to not necessarily translate, but kind of embody the space of the mood of that. So, wondering why her skin feels like sand. The accomplished alchemist becomes blue scales on the belly of a sturgeon trapped in the waves of the Mediterranean Sea, becomes aluminum under the gold plating of 2 spoons crossed in the open casket of a quail's egg, becomes the sweetness of milk dissolved in an injured physician's cup of coffee. She hides in the long wet hairs of his black handlebar mustache, escapes into the air when he coughs a cough of black smoke into the air, flushed like a goose stumbled into flight, flecked with buckshot. He is clenched for revenge after lifetimes of stifled rage. He is in hate with the parentheses around his left fist. He is a sporting man with a belly full of scrambled eggs and breath as thick as butter. Night, blood. Of course she runs into the streets where the black stones are passing out. Of course she finds a blind corner, pauses to think of X-ray machines and calculators that conspire against her in laboratories before bringing a plumed bottle of water up to the hole in her chest. She can feel the row of fluorescent lights in her spine. She can feel a handful of sugar suffering in water. The physician is 20 stethoscopes away and closing with 2 rusty spoons nearly crossed into an X. Suddenly her water becomes unfair, breaks simply in the bodies around him. Suddenly becomes unfair, leaves a pile of rotten caviar, a shoe full of sugar, a single peacock feather riddled with lice. A fisherman swoons poisoned by tainted poultry. The physician draws an X in the rubble with a knuckle from his right hand, fishes for a ghost until dawn, but the alchemist is accomplished, her grains scattered by his heavy breath. 20 blocks away, a little girl throws a firecracker at the feet of a little boy. Gold sparks burn the short blonde hairs of his legs. That last line, I had a friend a long time ago who worked as a page in the genealogy department of the downtown library, and he would just discover weird, interesting stuff. And some of it was like stuff people would get in trouble for doing in the 1800s, and it was just this log of like sort of mischief. And one of the things was like, and these little boys would throw firecrackers at the feet of little girls. And so it's like old-timey bad behavior is. So let's see. So maybe I'll read. So this is a sequence of prose poems. They're all sort of connected, and it's the middle part of this book. It's called "The Thing I Do Is Speaking," and this is when I kind of figured out a way of writing a poem, cutting it up, rearranging it, but trying to kind of like make it feel connected in a way. For those of you that work in like repeating forms like villanelles or sestinas or anything like that, I can't do that. Like it's real tough to actually fit within that form, but I wanted to do a prose poem that sort of felt like these elements were kind of coming back and reconnecting and breaking apart and stuff. So this is like my prose poem version of like a formal poem or something. Like, you find different ways to cheat at things that you're not good at as a writer. So. The thing I do is speaking. I can't picture myself, but I know my name. It is simpler than the accomplished place I am outside. Please, anything except my tin, the tiny cup. You are not my mouth, but it sounds like you, the illustrations I picture. I know how to read signs. I have flames. Do not touch the bees. Dissolved in the dome, the lost signals form. I think, I remember, and I am still. The vapors remain themselves. At first I was quiet, keeping track of myself. You said you consider yourself bees, tin bees, and bees. I watched the ground weigh itself, lured to the ground. I don't want to say anything about us, what we are made of, or the tin cup the teller's mouth ruined. When I can't think of another, I use the word signal. You would sound so good beside my name. It is pictorial, from the painting. I can't place you. How do you know my work? You can touch anything except for me. Come outside, please. You have strayed in my mouth for so long. Between your sounds, I am not quiet. Remember the place that I am. I was named. I have form. I want to watch the work as it speaks, but I can only hear my own signal. You were lured to the bees. I use the word picture to think of something else. Please, remain yourself. I think I and picture you. Touch, read. Remember, you illustrated me. Lost signal. I never knew how to ground. You stray in the reeds. I think I am here to see something else. At first you were miniature, floating outside. Now it sounds like I can touch the ground. The sun has been practicing those tiny flames all night. You approach yourself, dissolving. I say I am simpler than my form sounds in your mouth. You are not quiet. You accomplish yourself silently. I watch my tin, the tiny flames, you launching into you. When you are in my place, I hear myself outside. The gases go by, but I am grounded. The last time you assembled, you said I was pictorial. You are not pictorial, and I am like sod for a miniature of flames. Touch the dome. It is not still. The sun gases go by outside. Please repair my mouth. I need it to work. I'm so sorry I ruined your bees. I was lost in the signal. I don't remember anything except the tin cup. The tin cup sounds like you. Hey, I never knew how to whistle. Between your dissolve and my frame, a paper buries itself. How did you fit inside those tiny illustrations? I'm afraid I can't read. Come closer. I've been tuning all night. I can tell you are moving behind my ear. And this is the last poem in the book that George mentioned a little bit. It's called The Two Sound. And I was thinking of that title in a couple ways, like the sort of sound of moving towards something that's unfamiliar, and it's T-O, so kind of moving towards something. And then also I was thinking in some languages, like especially French, there's like the form tu, which is you, and just things like that, the way that we're kind of connected to each other, but there's distance and dissonance too. The two sound. To look out a window is to want to be on the side of the birds. You arrange your arms so the distance is clear. If the entire was wound, breathed glass, a tooth embedded so far it burst, a cut of your cloth to negate every saw. You are the one after zero, the sister of A, bird tuned to ash, to pronounce your medicine in my mouth. I know I can never understand the, even if the was powder on my lips, unacknowledged and disguised as O0, A2? If my eye could stay glass, breathe and stem, can a wound enter the was? Can one entire turn? Stay, I know the tired sound. To look out a window is to be embedded inside birds. If I could amplify your glass, atone for the sound of my incessant lips, you are A2, tuned to has, ash. You are the you and, the two sound, the utter the. If I have to spit out all my teeth to stay in the, is it all to say the weight of the? If I could stay lost to sound, if a single eye could say to breathe glass, to unwind a wing, to say the entire wound is window, stone turned to sound, if the sting unwound itself as sleet, as rain in the cut stem, if the window to pronounce magnifies, you are the one after end, the burned bird I woke up in. And then I'll just read two short poems from. This is my second, and I don't know if it's easier or more difficult to pronounce. Tuned droves. George got it right. Like every other intro I've ever been given, it's like they're to the sound, tuned sacred text. But it's my own fault. I mean, it's totally my own fault. Yeah. It's like if you sort of like structure your titles to facilitate dyslexia, like you can't be really upset with how that works. So this is just a real short poem from about 3/4 way through the book. And the title is Inside Any Good Song, Someone Is Lost. And when I wrote it, I guess I just sort of thought that sounded cool, but I've sort of come to actually think about it as like inside any kind of good piece of art or any kind of good experience, there's some part of it where you're lost and some part of it where you're moving towards being oriented in some larger sense. So inside any good song, someone is lost. There is a splash. There is another splash. There is another. There is a man, 2 women, a boy, and a boy. Something else. Someone else. I can't see past the wheat and birds I can't see. There is a singer. Is there a second singer? There is, that is. You can record yourself from the center of a parade. The clouds are large. You are little, and the clouds are so large. And then this is the last poem I'll read. So this is the last poem from the book. So spoiler alert, you know how both of these books end? So there's not a lot of suspense here. So this is called Orange Water. And when I had originally written it, I was kind of trying to see what the basic unit of a poem could be. So I tried to strip away like as many of the like verbs and I just wanted to sort of show the reader some stuff and like circulate it through and really pare things down. And it's come to mean something different to me. So there's a lot of bees that show up in this very short poem. And over the years, I've been thinking about it as a sort of like, I don't know, like prayer for the bees not to die out completely. So this one's going out to the bees. Orange water. The bloom, the boiling water, bees. Real flowers release bees. Real flowers bloom orange. Real bees bloom in boiling water. Real water releases bees. Boiling real bees releases flowers. The flowers bloom. The bees bloom. The water blooms. The boiling blooms. Real flowers. Real bees, real water. Flowers are not real. Bees are not real. Water is not real. Release the bees. Boil the bees. Water the bees. Real water. Orange flowers. Orange water. Thanks a lot. Sure, I'm up for that. Any difficult questions will be referred to Andrea.
So we have some time for Q&A, and please fire away.
Yeah, I wouldn't say fire away. You could
They'd love to answer
yeah. Anybody? There's no pressure either, you know. You don't. Yeah.
How is the current political situation moving your poetry?
I mean, in a lot of ways, it's sort of doing. I feel a little bit stuck, you know, like I feel overwhelmed, and so I haven't been writing as much, but I've been maybe reading more like kind of like long form journalism. So if I think an idea, I try to get into its larger context and history and stuff. And so some of the stuff that I'm writing now doesn't seem like it's overtly political necessarily, but there are a couple things that I wrote, but I don't know. I don't know if they're ready to see the light of day. I have some things that like definitely I was like, rah! But yeah, I would say, you know, I've been listening to this piece of music, like, and driving Andrea crazy, like the time that we've been sort of traveling out here by Julius Eastman. And it's called.
Like that
yeah, it's
song.
great. It's great. But I've been talking about how great it is, and it's sort of like it's like this minimalist piece of music, and it's just like a vocalist saying "stay on it, stay on it, stay on it," like over and over again with like this like minimalist sort of like kind of marimba thing, and like he was like very political. Like a lot of his stuff is like super like engaged in kind of you know, black political action and stuff, and he's just this kind of like amazing person. But like when you hear it, it just fills you up with this energy and with this sort of beauty and truth and power and like I don't know. And so it's not necessarily like about a specific political thing, but it's music like makes you want to like get out of bed and talk to people and do things, and it's not just that it's happy, it's that there's some sort of like lived experience and kind of profound thing behind that, you know? So I guess that's the model I'm using, is that like anything that kind of like gives people energy and doesn't drag us towards, you know, kind of doom and hatred and stuff is worth putting energy into. So I don't know. You probably are have some ideas about this too.
Well, what I read today was pretty old work, actually, but so the new thing that I'm working on, I haven't read to anybody yet, but I'm writing something that I'm calling an essay in couplets. So I'm using, you know, the 2-line form as another strategy. I sort of use structure, I guess, to write things. So it's my strategy to keep going with this poem, and it's become really long. It's over 20 pages now. So it is kind of behaving a little bit like an essay. And I'm weaving various imagery and things that are coming up in my daily life and my poetic life. So there's some political stuff in there, but again, it's not I don't want it to be the entire driving force of the poem. So the main thing that's driving the poem is Eric and I have been almost every weekend, we go to the Natural History Museum and look at the dioramas. So the diorama imagery is what is mainly driving the poem, but then through that it sort of takes me off onto other topics. You know, I'll have the buffalo in the diorama, and then there's this whole series in the poem, or section in the poem about the buffalo and what associations arise from that. So it's sort of using specific imagery to expand and then close something and then expand again. And the expansion might involve the political situation, and it might involve, you know, Beauty and the Beast, the myth. I realized something about that story when I was looking at the bison in the Natural History Museum. So,
yeah. I also wrote an elegy for Prince because I was mad at the world that Prince died. So that's, you know, that kind of thing. But yeah, other stuff. Yeah. Hey, Don.
I'm not good with names as many times I hear it. Is it Andrea or?
Yeah, Andrea.
Oh, Andrea, okay. First of all, thank you for giving me an idea. I've been working on a experimental memoir, and you gave me an idea dealing with sort of the your fiction and poetry type thing. I'm glad you shared that.
Oh,
Thank you. And Eric.
Oh man, I'm on the hot seat. Okay.
I remember sitting in class with you and always having a hard time trying to get through your poetry because I couldn't figure it out. All of a sudden I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you and I'm going, wow, I get it now. Okay. When are you coming back home so we can sit down together?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I sort of found that like so many things are like that for me too, where it's like, you know, you just sort of hear them and then the right thing sort of opens up, you know, to, yeah.
So, thank you. I'm serious though. When are you coming home?
Yeah, I don't know.
He's here right now.
I'll be yeah, we'll be back in the summer a little bit. So yeah, we'll have to hang out. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, George.
I think Dawn raises a really powerful point about the kinds of expectations with which we enter a poem. There are many powers to a poem, the sound of a poem, the imagery of a poem. But I think in our public perception, we tend to foreground narrative, that we think there's going to be a storyline. If we listen really closely to both of your work, there is indeed a narrative that's happening, but it's not foregrounded in terms of a hierarchy in which the narrative has the primary position. In certainly in the work that you read today. Could you talk a little bit today about the different elements that you weave into a poem that intermingle with narrative too?
Yeah.
Because I think narrative is certainly there, but it's also, your poems also speak about the ways in which narrative, the narratives, the stories of our lives are indeed fragmented in some ways and partial and collaged, and I think that might be interesting to hear how you both approach
we can
that.
probably both talk about that. I mean, I know for me, like, I guess I experience narrative in a poem less as like a coherent story that's contained by one poem and more in terms of a book-length movement. And so each book becomes like an environment that the reader can inhabit and explore and stuff. So it's like, rather than like, this is the story of like, me, Eric Baus, I went on a walk and I saw this thing. It's like, let's walk around and look at some, so I'm a little bit of a tour guide, but enough to like hang back so I don't ruin your experience, So some of it is like how prominent that sort of speakerly voice is in the poem, maybe. And the idea, I think narrative to me, oftentimes I experience it as like things being connected to one another or finding the subtle ways that things are sort of shaping one another. So that shows up a lot in the work. But yeah, maybe Andrea has something that we can.
Well, I tend to, the reason that I kind of put narrative in the background is because if I try to write a poem that's primarily driven by narrative, I feel myself directing things too much. Like I already know what the poem will be about, what it's arguing and all of that. So I'm more interested in the subconscious mind, like meaning arising that I'm not even aware of, so that when I read the poem again, I'm like, oh my God, this is, and I like that sort of epiphany moment. And I also like to be able to read things where I find many different meanings arising depending on when I'm reading it and that kind of thing. That's not to say, though, that the meaning isn't constructed by the poem. I do think that the meaning arises from within what is in front of you, and that it's not, however you read it. No, there are things in there, but you might. It's sort of, if you think about the threads, I'm weaving many different narrative threads with image and symbol and sound and meaning. And so you might, find one thread more prominent in one reading and another thread more prominent in another reading. And my main metaphor thinking about narrative, I did performance art when I did my MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I did all of these sort of sewing, I don't know why, but stitching and sewing based things, installations. And so when I did that stitch work, I realized there's a front thread that you see and then the back kind of nest messy threads. And I started to think about the page like that there's the poem that you see, and then there's this kind of undercurrent of meaning and narrative, kind of an etymology maybe. And so I'm kind of interested in seeing the relationship between that visible page and the unseen page and how it comes to the surface.
Can I follow up on that? I really loved that. And I'm just curious if you've ever tried to, like, it would be almost like displaying the backside of the quilt or something. Have you ever thought of ways of doing that? Because it's a beautiful image.
I've the thing I'm working on now, actually, I kind of abandoned the writing that I was doing when I was in MFA school, but now I'm looking at it again and sort of realize some new things about it, 10 or 15 years later. So that's the new thing I'm working on, trying to kind of draw out that stitch metaphor a little bit more and see how to talk about that in relation to writing and writing poetry. So I'm working on it. I'm still figuring it out. Yeah.
Have you ever, during your poetry, considered yourself like an architect who starts out with a basic idea that you want to express to people, but being from you, with the idea that, like, you're an architect working for a client, and you want the client gives you an idea. You're walking around in the world and you see everything, and you gather your own ideas. But do you see yourself reflecting them back to the people so that they understand themselves and what you're trying to tell them about themselves?
Yeah, so I think you're kind of asking about audience in a way. How do we think about audience? Well, I think about that in terms of I do write fairly abstractly, but I try to have entryways for the audience. So there are lines in the specific poems that should teach you how to read that poem, that give you a hint about the architecture, the structure of that poem or of the entire book. So if you look for that rather than looking for narrative, if you're looking for the kind of hint or a line that reveals the structure to you, then you have a much easier time of looking at that structure. You know how to move through the poem as a building. Does that make sense? Yeah, so if you want to.
Yeah, what she said. Yeah, I mean, I think architecture, I think, is a really good kind of metaphor for a poem or a book or something. You know, it's like there's many ways that you can move through a space once it's constructed, and you want to think about how people are going to use the space and how people are going to inhabit it too. So I think about that sense of the relationship between audience having something to do with like scale and time too, like how much time are people going to be able to spend in something. And the thing that I really try to not do is I try to not write poems where there's like a hidden meaning that I'm like withholding from the reader, or that they're trying to like guess or something. I guess in terms of things that I build into the poems to try to make them kind of like reach out to the audience in some ways, I would say like in that first book, like using like a form like the letter or something that's more familiar, so that like even if people aren't like necessarily steeped in poetry, they can, you know, connect to the parts of like receiving or writing letters and that sort of like gesture of feeling behind that. And then if there are some parts of it that seem like they're strange, there's some part of it that's also sort of tied to the ground a little bit too. And then some of it I think is just formal. Like I write big prose blocks, so some of that, like even if you're doing something weird, there's something about like the look of prose on the page, at least for me, that looks like very sort of like, oh, I'm looking at a newspaper. I'm looking at something that's much more sort of like normal and like easy to kind of process. So I think form and structure helps a lot, you know, in that way. That's a good question.
Eric, Dr. Harris is a physician. Could you read the title of your architecture poem in two sound, because it's apropos in terms of the architecture you're talking about, but also
My
in
son's
terms
an
of the body.
architect too.
Oh, that's great.
Similarities.
I actually taught, a couple of years ago, I taught a class, like last minute, like 3 days before it started, someone couldn't teach the class, and I took over for them, and it was like, architecture and narrative. And so I had to be like, what the heck, how do I make that work? And so, so architecture based on the structure of the small intestine was indeed a bad idea. So, it's like, so that's sort of like when the structure of the poem is a little bit kind of ornery. But yeah, I love that. Thinking about architecture it's actually probably the most useful way of thinking about like how at least like these kind of books function, as opposed to like telling a story or something, you know. Although the longer I've been writing, the more kind of patience I have for like more sort of direct narrative stuff. I saw Ed Hirsch read like a couple days ago, and like it just blew me away. And they're like very narrative poems too. And so I don't know. I try to read outside of what I write too.
Well, you've talked about audience, you've talked about the text. The third element of the triangle, of course, is the self. And George mentioned the self when he did the introduction to Andrea. And I think you both kind of enact an interesting poetics of the self, that it becomes a boundary you approach. But could you talk a little bit about the self in poetry? We're always taught, when we read a poem, this is not a history of the this is not the writer's personal history necessarily. Could you talk a little bit about the self?
Sure. You always have the smarter answer. You should go.
I'm like, I have to think about it for a second.
Well, piggyback off and be like,
Well, I guess when I'm teaching, I talk a lot about proximity and distance to a poem. Sometimes I feel like I'm much closer to a poem, and sometimes I'm much further away. Even if a speaker, is in both of those poems, I'm putting more or less of myself sometimes into the poem, and I can feel that. So half of what they carried flew away. I feel fairly far away from the poem because I've distanced it by thinking about it as character. I've even distanced it from the idea of poem by saying I'm writing a novel, even though know I'm not. I know I'm writing poems. So I wanted a lot of distance there, and I also wanted to focus a lot on that idea of the meaning arising from underneath the page to where it would become visible to me later. I didn't want to know who they were when I first started. I just sort of let it go. But and to be human is to be a conversation, which I didn't read from. That's about my personal life much more than the other two books are. So I'm very close to that speaker of the poem, although I do still try to keep some distance. And part of that is about how much I'm driving the meaning versus allowing the meaning to come to the poem. So I don't know if that's. I'll stop there and then see what Eric says.
So I always think that that's like the central question of whatever like poem or book I'm writing is like, what's the relationship between like, if there is a speaker or if it is either just language or if it's just imagery. And I've some poems where like this, so this book doesn't have any like personal pronouns in it. It's all just the same kind of sentence over and over again. And so I was really interested in, and in some ways it feels really personal to me because it's like the imagery becomes the stuff that feels like me rather than the pronoun that says like I feel this or I think this. So I sort of think about it as like, you know, if you go to a movie or something and then like someone is like sitting in front of you and you can see their head, it's like I want to duck down so people can see the movie. You know, yeah, I just want to sort of remove myself a little bit so people can see what I've arranged and structured in front of them. But at the same time, I feel like the longer that I write, the more I recognize parts of my thoughts and feelings in life in things that don't seem like they're how autobiographical it is, you know, because like you sort of said, like, oh, we're taught like there's like this gulf between the writer and the text, and it's like not always, you know, like there's things often are very kind of personal and intimate, but they don't often like signal like I think the pronoun thing I think is the tricky part, you know, being able to separate that kind of intimacy and perspective of the speaker from just that like word I, you know. And I read a lot of like French stuff where it's like you read, you know, like especially like old surrealism stuff where it'll be someone talking and it's like clearly like a sort of persona or something, you know, or it's like even like a non-human perspective or something, but it's still using I too. So that stuff I think is interesting.
I should probably say too, I tend to, I think about my work as kind of hybrid form. So I'm merging the poem and the essay in some way. So in the essay, there's the lyric I, and in the poem, there's the I. So I'm thinking about that kind of entangling. And I guess in the essay, the speaker, you're seeing the way their mind works in terms of how they make connections and reveal argument and that kind of thing. But it's also very outward facing, you know, it's not just reflecting back to me or holding a mirror up to me. It's something that is being pushed outside of the writer so that everyone in the room and I could examine it from a distance in some way.
Hey, Chris.
I just want to say real quick, because I see stuff differently as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing the aspect of structural architecture and self, as Steve is talking about, in the aspect of jazz, mm-hmm. and particularly with Coltrane's my favorite thing. Mm-hmm. So we start out somewhere with a narrative that we know about, mm-hmm. and then he goes off in self. Mm-hmm. And then it's like a conversation to merge self and architecture, and we come back with dun, dun, and you're like, oh, this is where we, you know, it kind of, and so it just felt like I should say that because it seems like that's how how you're addressing it in the sense of structure into self, and then coming out with this kind of new merging of what it is.
Yeah, I think that's really true for both of us, you know, or for a lot of folks too. That idea of like you try to find something that will like work as like the base, and then you have something where like you know some sort of familiar structure, even like a melody, you know, like in the Coltrane thing, or like even in like sort of Coltrane's like really weird late stuff, which I love, is like my favorite stuff, where like you're like, this isn't even music, this is great. It's just like these sheets sort of hitting you, you know, like there are these like little sort of like almost abstract clusters of sound that you can kind of go back to too. So I think it just depends on like kind of how melodic you want to, like how much of a sort of like arrow you want to show your reader, like this is the melodic part, and how much you're like trust them to kind of feel that they're gonna feel like the boop boop that like happens every like 17 minutes in like a 2-hour piece or something, you know. So yeah, how much you want to give over to the listener or reader. You know?
I mean, I think all of those things kind of sound like you have some kind of foundational element: sound, image, architecture, structure, form, and then the improvisational part is what the poet or the writer does. That kind of, so you have the groundedness in that foundational element, and then the improv sort of lets you ascend.
My teacher, Judy Johnson, used to call it the skeleton of the poem. You can hang all this other stuff around it. These questions and answers are fabulous. We could go on forever, but I want to give Andrea and Eric a chance to speak intimately with their fan club and to eat cookies, and I hope you have a chance to look at their books, and I'm sure they'd be happy to sign books for you as well. So thank you all for coming and having such a wonderful turnout.
Thanks so much.